Tonight we have the pleasure of introducing Zoe Reid. And Zoe is an accredited conservator and established the Conservation Department in the National Archives in 2002. And she's been responsible for safeguarding the long-term preservation of the national collection and ensuring safe public access to the archives. And over the past 20 years, she has presented her work at international conferences and been widely published in conservation journals. And in 2022, she joined the senior management team as Keeper of Public Services and Collections. She's heavily involved in the new virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, which tries to provide an open access virtual archive of much of the documentation destroyed in the explosion at the PRO in 1922. And her talk will give more information on this huge project where she is senior conservator. Now, we all talk about preserving our own data and find it a difficult subject. It always seems to come up in our weekly meetings. But imagine being responsible for the preservation of historical data on a national scale. It promises to be a very interesting talk. So please give a very warm welcome, fearful to Zoe Reid. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now, hello everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to join your monthly meeting this evening. I'm going to share my screen and then we can get on with the presentation. And here we go. Now, can everybody tell me, can you see that nice big picture?
We can.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to minimize me so I don't have to look at me talking too much, which is the good thing. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the whistle-stop tour of recovering the archives from the Public Record Office of Ireland. So a little bit of background, but I'm sure you all are very, very familiar with this sad story at this stage. So during the Civil War, the anti-treaty army occupied the forecourts, and they went in on the Monday, Thursday, so the day before Good Friday in April 1922, into this magnificent structure. So here we're looking at a photograph of the Public Record Office and the Treasury building behind it from 1914. So the front block, which you can see very clearly with the portico front, is still there today, and the bit at the back with the 10 lovely arched windows running down either side, that's the bit with the Record Treasury, and that's where the archives were stored. And they called it a treasury because it had held all the treasures of the Public Record Office. So this building was actually built, started building in 1864 and completed in 1867. And when they started to build it, it actually wasn't for the Public Record Office of Ireland at all. It was for the records of the Law Society and the law courts. But what happened in those intervening 3 years was they introduced the Public Records Act in the UK. Great Britain and Ireland, and that brought in the need for a Public Record Office to be based in Ireland. And so this building was handed over to Samuel Ferguson, who was the first keeper of the Public Record Office in 1867. And what I do love about this photograph, and sometimes when I've given this presentation and you can blow it up, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. If I do this, do you just see here? And you see here, and even if you look very closely here, we've got some of the staff are in the windows, looking out from the office windows at the photographer in 1914. I've tried to do as much research as I can about who actually took the pictures, and I've not had any joy as yet. But that's a mission that I'm determined to try and get to the bottom of that one. So here's our building as it was. And here's our building as it became on the 30th of June. So as we all know, unfortunately, all too well, the anti-treaty forces occupied the forecourts from the April until the June, and things escalated towards the end of June. With the end of June, the whole forecourt site was occupied. And on the 20th of June, the instructions were given to bombard the forecourt to remove the anti-treaty forces out of the forecourts complex. As part of that bombardment and shelling, a fire broke out on the 30th of June, and a destructive fire in so much as it destroyed the entire Public Record Office Treasury building, as we can see here. And so what happened on that afternoon when the fire started in the 30th of June 1922 was 100,000 square feet of shelving, which had been organised into 5,500 series of records, which basically had been accumulated over 7 centuries. So told us the history of Ireland in over 7 centuries were destroyed in one afternoon. And to me, this is an incredibly sobering picture. I look at it and I know what the staff did next, and I'm always amazed at what they did next. And if you go into the current forecourt site, this is now part of the car park. And you can see, you know, if you're walking around that building, and that structure of what was there is now just up to this top part of the wall. And then what's the very ugly, as we all consider it, the Land Commission building is what was built on top of it in the late 1960s. So that's what was destroyed. So the immediate aftermath, and I suppose I've been very privileged because through a number of archival sources I've had the privilege of working on, I've been able to piece together the story of immediately what happened aftermath. I can now say that we know that on the 2nd of July, Michael Collins visited the site as both Commander-in-Chief of the Free State Army and as Minister of Finance. And the first people on the site were mainly Herbert Wood, who was Deputy Keeper of the Public Record Office at the time, Hugh Kennedy, who was the Senior Law Officer of the Forecourts. Michael Collins came down that day as well, along with Richard Mulcahy, and basically to look at the charred remains, to decide what would happen, that this site needed to be secured, and how were they going to recover from the site and the destruction of the site. So they employed, what had happened before was, I suppose, they looked to the resources that they had, and the communications that are on one of the office files that relate a lot of this story basically tell how the toing and froing goes. Herbert Wood wanted to get onto the site pretty much immediately. Richard Mulcahy had to make sure that the site was safe for them to go into, that there weren't any more explosives in the area. Once they did that, on about the 11th of July, 10th, 11th of July, then they appointed an OPW engineer, a gentleman called Chandler Smith, John Chandler Smith. And John Chandler Smith had also been in charge of the recovery of the Customs House in 1921 after that destructive fire. So they brought him on board as their man to make sure the site was safe for staff to go into. He did that, he secured the site, they put up hoarding, and eventually they allowed staff to go back in on the 17th of July. In 1922, and the staff was led by James Morrissey, who was Assistant Deputy Keeper at the time. I do know that another senior, what we would consider now archivist at the time, Charles McGarry, also was part of that team. And some of the other staff went into the destroyed site to pull out whatever remains they could. And I mean, it makes perfect sense that they went in to try and salvage the records that they knew would potentially be in there, and they could identify and look at stuff and see it. And what did they do? And this, I have to say, as somebody who came along 95 years later, I will be forever grateful that they did this. And to me, I absolutely adore these 3 parcels in this photograph of them. They no longer look like this. We only have one parcel that we actually didn't unwrap. But I'll come to that later. So basically the staff went in and identified amongst all that building rubble, the documents that they knew, and they removed them carefully. They were given a room in the record office in Dublin Castle where they could clean and identify further the archives. And that's what they did. And this was standard in terms of how they secured parcels of archives within the Public Record Office, brown paper and string, and putting a label on them. If you go back through the Deputy Keeper's reports from sort of the 1890s through into the early 19th century or 1900s, they talk constantly about sorting and arranging and wrapping in parcels the collection that was in the Record Treasury. So it makes sense that this is the material that they had on hand and they used to do exactly the same thing with the fragments. And as we've said before, the fire damage documents range from the 14th century all the way to those very early years of the 20th century. But here you can see what they've done. They've labelled them. We've got some labels of where they might have been originally in the Treasury. You can see that on the label behind. And then on the front one, you can see a label which is what became a more contemporary location within the forecourts in the 1950s. So the exciting part for me, so in 2017, I suppose we were in the middle of the decade of commemorations, and people were saying, right, you know, what's what do we need to be working on? What do we need to be thinking about? What do we need help and support doing as part of this commemorations program? And the obvious one for me had always been these parcels. I'd known about them since I came into the archives in 2002, the brown paper parcels that in many cases rattled and were quite scary whenever people opened them. And we didn't permit opening of them very often. And when we did, I would always be like, okay, let's put it away again. No, we can't look at that. So one of the bodies, and this was a lovely segue, that we received funding from the Irish Manuscripts Commission, that organisation which had been set up in 1928 in response to the destruction of the Public Record Office in an attempt by the state to try and recover lost archives and to make archival sources available in secondary form. So they gave us some funding, and what I did with that money was I put together a very concentrated survey. I knew as the sole conservator in the National Archives, this was a job that I couldn't do on my own. I needed to bring project staff in and focus them on just one task, and this was their job. So it was 16 weeks. I had a project conservator and I had a conservation assistant who also happened to be a photographer, a very good photographer. She trained as a photographer, and that was in many ways, it's managing the project. That was a stroke of luck and a stroke of genius, we could say, because what we did was we documented absolutely every element of those parcels being opened, the parcels before they were opened, as they were opened, the contents as they were originally found. So we generated approximately 8,000 photographs, and those 8,000 photographs were the images of the 378 parcels that had been identified as having come from the Public Record Office that hadn't been surveyed before. There was a box list. We could tell from the label on the outside, which was still a historic label, what might be on the inside, but we hadn't done a comprehensive survey. So that's what we spent 16 weeks in 2017 doing. And the results were pretty much as you'd expect in terms of damage and condition, but there were some surprises. And being conservators, we're very methodical people and we like to give things numbers. So what we did was we looked at all these collections and we worked out a criteria, a grading system as such, depending on the condition of the documents. And we used certain criteria. If something could be opened as a document and read, then it was given a grade 1. If you could read the text, if it was clear to read. If something was a little bit damaged around the edges and was a little bit more tricky to open, needed a bit more persuasion, if it was badly damaged, it would be a grade 2, all the way down to a grade 5, which were incredibly damaged and like the things you take out of the fire at the end of a good night in the middle of the winter. And I've got some more photographs of that, but I think the next one's this. The next one's the numbers games. So the contents of the parcels, and this was an early guesstimate from that survey. So we had approximately 16,000 sheets of parchment, various document formats, so rolls, small receipts, large folded documents. We had about 9,000 sheets of loose paper and manuscripts that had survived. And of course, from a material point of view, that made perfect sense. Parchment, because it's animal skin, is a lot more robust than paper. And so in the seat of a fire, what happens to parchment is it shrinks, it dehydrates, whereas paper will burn and become crispy. And even if it's heated, the paper fibers become very short, so the paper becomes very brittle. With the vellum, it's very different. And because of the way things were rolled and wrapped and folded and stored, sometimes the outer part of a large vellum manuscript would be damaged, but the bits inside would be in quite good condition. And here we can see, in terms of breaking down the numbers of our 378 parcels, roughly what it broke into. We had about 28 contents of 28 parcels that I would say were in good condition, all the way through to 45, which were really in vulnerable condition. So we did the survey, and that was the results of the survey. And then, because we'd engaged really well with the Irish Manuscripts Commission, we'd had a very successful Twitter campaign highlighting the work that we were doing. We'd created a good bit of visibility around the work. We were successful in securing a second tranche of funding for another 16 weeks. So in that 16 weeks, I had a slightly different team. The photographer didn't want to do the cleaning, so that was fine. She went off to do something else. I got another conservation assistant. And so we cleaned, as you can see, nearly 3,000 pages of paper and nearly 1,000 sheets of parchment. So that was the contents That's how much was in those 28 grade 1 parcels, because that's all we touched in that initial 16-week project. And here we've got some images to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of condition. So the one that looks very much like a piece of coral and something that should be in the Natural History Museum here on the bottom left, that's what I would consider about a grade 4, actually. Looking at it now, we might have given it a 5 back in the day, but about a 4. That is a number of receipts, covenants from legal cases in the 1820s that are sort of sheets of parchment that would be approximately about A5 in size, and that they were all strung together with a cord all the way through them. And that's how they reacted to the fire. Up above here, we've got a collection of collectors, revenue exchequer collectors account material. Again, we've got some parchment pieces here that are barely damaged at all, these parchment receipts. These are folded pieces of paper. Again, just these aren't looking too bad. These are in pretty good condition. Here we again have some legal documents from the 1850s, again, just charred at the very edges. This little scrappy piece here is actually from one of the earliest medieval rolls from the 14th century. And it's in pretty bad condition. And if you consider that's actually just a small piece of potentially a very long membrane of parchment. And then these little guys, which I love doing, they were one of the first projects I did. These were the same little vellum receipts like this, but have been stored and reacted to the heat in a totally different way. And they literally look like a fan. And that was basically, they were perfectly flat to about the final 1/3 of them, and then they just had expanded and contracted in the heat and with the moisture of the rain and the elements, I suppose, they were exposed to for the best part of the year while they were waiting to be salvaged. And then this multiple slide here is some of those photographs of some of the things that conservators love to do in terms of cleaning and getting the dirt off our documents and making the text visible and making them stable in terms of reading them and making them available to lovely researchers like yourselves. That's what the aim is, essentially. And so back in 2000, and we're up to 2018, 2019, I suppose, there was also the element of how do we go about conserving these documents? How do we take them from something that's badly damaged into a document that could be used by a researcher? And in those early days, even though I was a conservator with considerable experience at that stage, nearly 20 years experience working with things, I'd never quite come across the like of the fire damaged material in the extent that I had whenever I was doing this project. So I suppose I did what anybody sensible would do. I did lots of research as much as I could. And then also I decided to do things that I considered relatively easy, first of all, to see how the materials would react to the conservation treatments I wanted to apply. So both of these are showing a wonderful technique, which is humidification. And the only way to describe it in layman's term really is imagine giving the paper and the parchment, it's almost like a facial. I have a thing called an ultrasonic humidifier, which turns water into a fine mist, a vapor. What that does is very gently and in a controlled way reintroduces moisture back into vellum and paper. Basically, why this is good to do is if you're worried about the stability of inks on any of your documents, this is a very gentle way to do it, rather than perhaps either immersing the documents in water or trying to spray them with a light spray of water, again, to get some moisture back into them. And the reason we're doing this is to make them more flexible, so I can start to manipulate them and get them flat again. And this is what you see here. So those are those little parchment receipts, not too bad along one side, and one side's all crinkly and crackly. A bit like a crispy pompadour is the easiest way sometimes. If you've ever cooked a pompadour, you'll know how it crisps up in the heat of the fat in the fire. And so the parchment had done the same. And here I'm using a lovely technique, which is relatively new in the sense of conservation terms. It's probably about 5-8 years old at this stage. People are using magnets, and what I'm using here are very, very strong little neodymium magnets that have a very, very hard, very very great strength to them, but they're quite small in their circumference. I've got them wrapped in a little bit of felt and a little bit of plastic, partly for two reasons. One, to make sure that they don't leave indentations onto the damp vellum, but also it makes them easier for me to handle. They're like little sweets. I can kind of pull them up then. And here we have the results. We've got some of these receipts. Unfortunately, the ink has kind of definitely faded along here, where we're losing some of the detail, but we're still getting an awful lot of access to detail here, which are names received by and money from. And again, these are receipts for quarterly returns as part of the port material. And then this selection of papers, the same paper documents, these are quite wonderful. These were the 1798 yeomanry returns from County Carlow. These were very large format forms, and you'll see a photograph, and I'll explain these in more detail in a couple more slides. But essentially, it's the monthly wages bill for yeomans in County Carlow. And so as they were going for their training, they were listed. And so we have a long list of names of the gentlemen who are going for training, their ranks within the army, the yeomanry army, and then the amount they were being paid, and they had to sign for it. And there were 66 of these forms, again, folded quite small. You can see where the fold lines are, but again, just fire damage down the center, where basically that was the outer edge of the fold, and that was the only piece that had been affected. So they were in many terms, and then here I'm choosing the correct color tissue to make sure that I can stabilize and close the damage that's there, but not disguise any of the text or obliterate or hide any of the text from researchers. And the yeomanries are a great example, one of the first projects we did as part of the virtual treasury, which showed the strength of what we were doing and the capabilities of that project, and how the different elements could all come together very, very nicely. And probably, I'm sure at this stage, I don't need to explain what the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland is. But for those of you who might not be familiar, it started off as a research project, and that part was known as Beyond 2022. And it was a very ambitious project to recreate. Oh, I have the video. I have a video later, so I won't say any of that. I have a short video to show you from the project. But why this slide is here and why I'm talking about this is a more detailed image of that yeomanry return. You can see where it's being repaired very nicely here. Oh, that's gone. And then here we have the names quite clearly of the different men. And if I'm right, the next slide, oops, there we go. Here we go. The next one, this is the video. We've got about a 3-minute video, and this should work. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, no. No, sorry. Sorry, folks. Yep. Can you hear that okay? You could? Yep.
There's no sound, Zoe.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I wanted. Okay, so I have to remember how to do this. My apologies. And this is the bit that we hope to edit out. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing for a second.
When you go to share screen, it gives you the option to share sound as well.
It does. Okay, my apologies, folks. Share sound. Yep, there we go. Okay, I can take that back to the beginning. Yeah, let's go and go. Okay.
Dublin, June 30th, 1922.
Yeah.
There you go.
Day 3 of the Battle of the Four Courts, the opening engagement of the Irish Civil War. Shortly after noon, the city is shaken by a huge explosion. After the blast, fire takes hold and plumes of white smoke are seen billowing from an arcade of tall windows in a corner of the Four Courts complex. This is the Record Treasury of Ireland's Public Record Office. Irish history, dating back over 700 years, is on fire. Inside the Record Treasury, the intense heat melts the high ironwork galleries and shelving, casting paper and parchment records into the flames below. Miraculously, one part of the building survives almost intact, except for a blast hole in the side wall. The Record House, and at its heart, the handsome search room, where researchers pored over historical documents, had escaped the worst of the damage. Now supported by the Government of Ireland, the Beyond 2022 project is reconstructing the search room in virtual reality. Here, readers in 1922 conducted their research beneath the natural light of a beautiful glazed ceiling. And for the first time in a century, we can reopen the double doors that led to the Record Treasury, passing through the fire break which stopped the blaze spreading to the front of the building. On the centenary of the fire, 4 steps will take you on your journey through Ireland's virtual record treasury. Explore, locate, connect, discover. Entering through the record house, you can admire its elegant staircase before passing into the search room where your discoveries begin. From here, you can search the archive and travel to the very place in the lofty galleries of the Treasury where the records destroyed in 1922 have been reassembled from surviving copies and transcripts located in archives across Ireland and around the world. Now, next generation technology enables you to visualize the whole archive and make connections in ways that were unimaginable a century ago. Returning to the search room, you can discover more about the people, places and topics contained in the documents. Beyond 2022, unlocking the story of Ireland and its peoples across 7 centuries, and reopening a lost archive to new generations with new questions.
Excellent. So that's kind of gives you, I'm sure you've all seen that before, but it's still kind of, when I think about what we've achieved, it does take your breath away a bit. So one of the main things, obviously, as part of the project is their use of contemporary and modern technology in terms of bringing together all the sources and the different types of sources that are around and out there that previously were thought not available anymore. And one of the other things that they're doing is retrieving the written word using transcribus, which is essentially artificial intelligence for handwritten text recognition. So I'm sure as genealogists, you're all sort of very familiar with OCR, so optical character recognition, which can be done on typed words essentially, but this is doing the same thing but for the handwritten script, and that's what they've managed to do using transcribus on quite a sizable portion of the collections, and it's quite phenomenal in terms of how quickly transcribus, once it has learnt the text as such, and it takes about 4,000 characters I think to be inputted into the system for them to kind of learn the characters, and then it's amazing how quickly something like this, which our census returns from 1766, that sort of religious census that was taken then that we still have in the National Archives, can end up being transcribed. Okay, so here we've got an example of transcribus working on one of these pages. So here you've got the word Drumbri, and then if I go to the next slide, then suddenly you've got the list of the names underneath, just in terms of the names we have here, and here we have them here, and then I'm pretty sure that, yep, you can then transpose those and put them into an Excel spreadsheet. And when we were doing this for the first presentation where we were giving transcribus and sort of explaining it to people, I sent that image across to the guys on the virtual record treasury, and I think within an hour I had those 3 slides back and that complete document. And I mean, they probably had done it very quickly. That was all their editing time in terms of even getting the slides and the screenshots and everything sorted for me. So I mean, it was a very, very fast turnaround in terms of being able to open up the text that people can see in documents. So the progress to date in terms of the conservation, as I said, 2017, we did the survey, 2018 cleaning, 2019 into 2020 were really kind of spent doing some of the early preliminary conservation work of a small proportion. It's still very slow and painstaking work. I can't say I've conserved everything of the 378 parcels. We've only done a small fraction of it because of the resources we have. We did get a second pair of hands, which I was delighted about in 2021. Project conservator and project archivist were both appointed on a part-time basis. So we have progressed quite a bit, and that's where we are at the minute. And then we're looking at our next challenges, I suppose. Of all these things, it's like, well, what do you do next? And now we're into the phase of, we've got up and through to the launch. Now we're at the phase of trying to say, right, what are we going to do next with the resources that we have? And this is Peter Crooks looking at one of the medieval, the early King's Bench rolls from, again, I'm going to say the 14th century. I'm trying to, I think, no, 15th century. This is KB 1/6, and I'm fairly sure it's late 1470s. But quite amazing in terms of content, but also quite amazing in terms of condition. So we've been working our way through actually these King Bench rolls in terms of conservation. So we've done 1, 2, I think 3 and 6 are the 2 tricky ones for us to do, but we're kind of working our way through those. And then what we're doing as well, and exploring ourselves in terms of trying to reveal text that can't be easily read. We're looking at the conservation scientists and looking at different ways that perhaps we can access the information that's in the documents. So we're looking at a thing called X-ray microtomography, which is using a micro CT scanner, one from a dental hospital. So the fragments have to be quite small. So we're in negotiations to try and arrange that work to happen. We're looking at multispectral imaging, which allows us to photograph documents in different wavelengths, and then map those over one another to reveal text that we can't see with the human eye, but can be seen in different wavelengths. And then X-ray microfluorescence is a technique, non-destructive analytical technique for analyzing the writing materials, which again, has an interest, again, perhaps to quite a specialized interest, but has an interest in terms of what people were using to write with at the time. Okay, and so this is the project team so far. And I'm getting a little bit of an echo, so I might just stop there. So the project team so far and the work that we've done so far, because even though for a number of years I've been the sole conservator in the National Archives, all this work was done with the team, and it's very much a team effort and bringing people on board and the right people on board. So, and I'm very grateful to those who've supported the conservation work, the Irish Manuscripts Commission and the Virtual Record Treasury project. So I think, yeah, and then to learn more, I've just thrown up the couple of websites there. Obviously, the virtualtreasury.ie and the National Archives are a website as well. Okay, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Okay, how are we doing? It's about half an hour. Hello.